A star defensive lineman requests a trade, but calm down, Jets fans. Dexter Lawrence is not a good fit here. I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I am John B. from GangGreenNation.com, and on today's show, we'll talk about why the normal trade value chart goes out the window in the 2026 NFL Draft. We'll talk about why the Jets need to invest in acquiring more mid to late round draft picks. It is important, believe it or not. But we'll begin by talking about the big news of the NFL on Monday. It came from New York, but from the other team. Dexter Lawrence, the Giants' star defensive tackle, has requested a trade. And as happens with every big-name player who requests a trade, Jets fans are now speculating about whether the Jets can swing a deal to acquire this star. And I try to come up with ways it could make sense for the Jets. So we know that the Jets are loaded with draft capital. If a star player, Dexter Lawrence or somebody else, becomes available in the next 2 years, the Jets certainly will have the picks necessary to make a trade. The Jets also have a lot of cap space, which will be acquired for a contract extension. Normally, not all the time, but in most cases, when a star player is traded, he wants a new contract, and the team who acquires him gives him a new contract. I think that in a world where Lawrence could be acquired for a price lower than the Jets got for Quinnen Williams, there could be some logic there. It's almost like we traded one star for a big price and got an equal, if not better player for a lower price. You know, that could be a savvy investment strategy. I can see that. But big picture, Dexter Lawrence is just not a fit here. And I think it's true on multiple levels. Number one, if you've been following what's been going on with the Giants the last couple of years, there has been a lot of buzz that Dexter Lawrence is unhappy with that team. And the biggest reason he's unhappy with that team is he's tired of losing. The Giants have been every bit as bad as the Jets over the last decade plus. I know the Giants maybe had that 1 year in 2022, Brian Daboll and Joe Shane's first year where they made the playoffs and won a playoff game, but the Giants have been a very, very unsuccessful franchise over the last decade plus. In fact, I think you could make the case the Giants have been a very unsuccessful franchise since they won the Super Bowl in 2011. They went on a magical run in the playoffs. Of course, it kind of started late in the regular season in an infamous game Christmas Eve against the Jets, but Giants have had losing season after losing season after losing season. And if you follow the buzz around that team, this has been building for a long time. Dexter Lawrence has been unhappy with the losing with the Giants. Now, if you want to be optimistic, you can say Jets have a lot of draft picks. Jets have a lot of cap space over the next couple of years. Things might be looking up here, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with being optimistic. But if you're Dexter Lawrence and you've spent your entire career, for the most part, on really bad teams, and you look across town and you see the Jets as an option, and they've missed the playoffs 15 straight years, and they've had 10 straight losing seasons. I think that most people in his shoes, if they're being objective, would say, I need to see them have a good season before I believe. So I don't think Dexter Lawrence would be very happy about coming to the Jets. To come up with a scenario where Dexter Lawrence would be thrilled to come to the Jets, it would have to be that he values staying in New York above all else. Maybe he likes living here. I don't know. Maybe he likes, his local restaurants or something, but he had to value it above all else except staying with the Giants, where he's so upset with the Giants that he wants to leave. But we'll ignore any other factor. I want to stay in New York. Let's go to the Jets. I don't think that that's terribly likely. And you might ask, well, who cares what he wants? If he gets traded, he has to come here. And that's true. But I just don't think he's a fit in any sense. And I don't really need to go far back to explain this concept, because in 2023 and 2024, the Jets went all in on veterans. They went all in on big names. And a lot of those people they got were older in 2023 and 2024 than Dexter Lawrence is now. Dexter Lawrence is 28 years old. He still could have some good seasons left. He still could be a dominant player. And again, in a world where the Jets would be able to acquire him for less than the Cowboys gave the Jets for Quinnen Williams, you come off looking pretty savvy because you got a guy who's at least as good as Quinnen Williams for a lower price. I think the Giants are going to look at the price the Jets got for Quinnen Williams, and that will be the price for Dexter Lawrence. I mean, that would be pretty logical. I don't think you're the Giants, you're trading Dexter Lawrence at a discount, particularly to your crosstown rival. But I think you set a dangerous situation if you acquire Lawrence. First of all, the Jets need a lot. If we're being honest, this is a team that still has a lot of holes, even after a pretty aggressive free agency period. Jets brought in some guys. They hope it will work out, but I don't think this is a team that's Dexter Lawrence away from having a successful season. And you're likely going to have to give him a pretty big extension. He's got 2 years left on his contract. So I guess if you wanted to play it out, you could, but then you run the risk of Lawrence being unhappy. And look, I'm not going to say he's going to turn into Haason Reddick. Haason Reddick was a pretty extreme case, but it underscores some of the dangers in acquiring a player who wants to be in a certain spot and who wants a contract. Because when the Jets got Reddick, it was a move that received a ton of praise from the national media, as all Jets moves when they acquire big names receive. And there was talk about how the Jets had built a Super Bowl defense, about how Reddick was a star pass rusher who was going to reinvigorate the Jets pass rush, how savvy the Jets were to get him for just a third-round pick. Well, I think, first of all, we underrate the value of a third-round pick. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But Reddick's not the only case where this has happened. And the 2023-2024 period is the most recent period where this has happened, but it's happened before that. The Jets have been notorious over the years for chasing big names right as they're leaving their primes. And sometimes what happens is you give that guy the last payday, or the guy wants the payday and doesn't get it, and he kind of loses his motivation. Will it happen? Would it happen with Lawrence? I can't say, but it's a real danger. And one of the things I talked about on this show before free agency began is I want to get guys in their mid-20s on their second contracts. I don't want to get guys in their late 20s or their 30s on contract 3, contract 4. The Jets did a little bit too much of that for my liking in free agency this year, and when you also factor in trades. And I think acquiring another player who's approaching 30, and look, make no mistake about it, Dexter Lawrence, I think, likely has some good years left in him. Probably more than Demario Davis does. Certainly more than Geno Smith does. Probably more than Minkah Fitzpatrick does, although that one's a little bit more up in the air. But the Jets are a rebuilding team, yet they've gotten unmistakably older. And I think that there was some value in adding some veteran leadership this offseason. I think you could make a very strong case that the team was a little bit too young last year. I'm all for embracing youth in a rebuild period. Maybe the Jets could have used a few more veteran leaders in the locker room to stabilize things, particularly during periods where things got away from them, where things got out of control. I think having some calmness and having some veterans in the locker room can be helpful. But adding another guy who's closer to the end of his career than the start, I think that there's some real danger in that. And it kind of puts the Jets in no man's land, where you can't really say you're expecting to have a winning season, but you have enough older players and you're not really rebuilding. And this has been like a no man's land the Jets have found themselves caught in quite often over the last 15 years. There have been cycles that have repeated over and over and over for the Jets. And it usually begins with a player like Lawrence becoming available, and people calling it a can't miss move, people calling it a no-brainer. Frequently, the Jets get these guys, and then it doesn't work out for the reasons that I just mentioned. So I can appreciate why Jets fans might want Dexter Lawrence. I think on paper, in broad strokes, there are some areas where I could see it being a fit. You talk about the Jets still kind of having a need of defensive tackle. I mean, I think they've addressed the position and brought stability to defensive tackle this offseason, in addition to the guys they already had. But there's no real star at defensive tackle. They have the picks to make a move. They have the cap space to extend Lawrence if necessary. But I just don't think that this is a player who fits the Jets' timeline. I don't think he'd want to be here. And you can dismiss that all you want. I do think that there is a potential problem if you acquire a guy who doesn't want to come here. I think Dexter Lawrence probably wants to go to a winning team. And that's a driving force behind him requesting the trade from the Giants. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll zoom out a little bit because trading for Dexter Lawrence is probably going to be costly in terms of draft picks. And despite the fact the Jets have 2 first-round picks this year, 3 first-round picks next year, 2 second-round picks this year, I think they need more picks, particularly late day 2, early day 3. Yes, they have picks to add impact players, but There's so much more they need to add, and we'll explain why mid and late round picks are underrated, even in a weak draft class, as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Financial stress is something a lot of people are carrying right now, and it's not just about numbers. It can affect your sleep, your relationships, and your overall mental health in ways that build up over time. And the reality is, struggling with money doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it just means you haven't had the right kind of support. It's really easy to put pressure on yourself financially without really talking about it. The stress that comes with trying to figure out everything on your own, the expectations you feel to have everything together, and how that pressure can spill into other areas of your life. Therapy is not just about financial advice, it's about working through the stress, the anxiety, and the emotions that come with it. With over 30,000 licensed therapists and more than 6 million people served, BetterHelp makes it easier to get matched and start focusing on what you need. When life feels overwhelming, therapy can help. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's betterhelp.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Hey, don't forget to check out the Everydayer Club for ad-free episodes and access to a group chat with other listeners of the show. Tap the link in the show notes or go to lockedonnnyjets.supercast.com to learn more. Well, in our first segment, we talked about Dexter Lawrence, this Giants star defensive tackle who could be available in a trade. He wants a trade. It's not clear whether the Giants will oblige him and deal him. I don't think he's a good fit for the Jets on many levels. And even though the Jets do have the picks to bring a player like Lawrence in, I don't know that that's the best move for this team right now. And I understand it may sound a little crazy to say I don't want a player like Dexter Lawrence. Well, I do want a player like Dexter Lawrence, but I look at the cost, I look at the risk, I look at what the player could bring to the table. I just don't think this is the right time for the Jets. I think there are other teams that make much more sense for Dexter Lawrence. And part of it is I really think the Jets need to invest in draft picks. I think that if you look at the last 15 years, one theme that's occurred over and over is the Jets don't value their draft picks enough. They are way too willing to send picks out for veteran players. And to be clear, I'm not against it all the time. I think that in targeted approaches, there can be a point where trading a pick for a veteran player makes sense for your team. I think the Jets have made some good pick for player moves through the years. Morgan Moses back in 2024, that was a pretty good move. Morgan Moses helped the Jets out, even though this 2024 season was a disaster. We can go down the list. Brandon Marshall back in 2015. Brandon Marshall was, an all-pro in 2015. That was a phenomenal trade. But you need to make sure you're investing in picks. And when you send a pick out, you need to replenish the well. You need to focus on acquiring more picks and to replace the picks that you have sent away. That's not something the Jets have been good at. The Jets have had too many 6-player draft classes through the years. And you may wonder why that matters. Well, the numbers show, and there have been a number of studies on this, that the teams that draft the best tend to be the ones that have the most picks. And I think it actually is more logical than you might realize. The drafting itself is an inexact science. You're projecting, a 22, 23-year-old, sometimes a 20, 21-year-old, and trying to figure out how they'll play at a higher level, more complex schemes. And then there are just some things you can't project. You can't predict injuries. I mean, I know the medical team can explain to you whether a guy could have a chronic condition that you have to be worried about. But once a guy gets to the league, some guys just end up suffering career-altering injuries that aren't predictable. They're just random, that are just chance occurrences. Now, I know some people may hear this and say, well, that's all well and good, but the Jets have loaded up. They have 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks this year. They got 3 first-round picks next year. They got their second-round pick. We're all set. Well, I think for starters, the Jets are beginning from a place where their talent level is really low. So 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks this year, 3 first-round picks, a second-round pick next year. The Jets need those more than other teams do. And I think the Jets need more picks. And part of it is, even with their bounty of first and second round picks over the next 2 years, those picks aren't going to cover every area of the team that needs fixing. And an argument that's been made is that Jets should trade all of their day 3 picks this year because this is a bad draft class, that they're just not going to be talent on day 3. That's a notion that I have to reject. And the reason why is I went back and looked at the 2013 draft class. And, if you're not familiar with this stuff, and why would you be? Why would you follow this stuff? It's a bit silly that I actually know this, but 2013 is considered like the worst draft in NFL history. It was just awful. But there still were good players drafted. DeAndre Hopkins was drafted in that class. Some outstanding talent was picked in 2013. Le'Veon Bell went in the second round that year. And even in a class that was arguably the worst class in NFL draft history, it wasn't just that there were good players drafted in round 1 and round 2. Now, DeAndre Hopkins was round 1, Le'Veon Bell was round 2. But I looked round 3 through round 7. There were 13 players who made at least one Pro Bowl. And 7 of those guys made at least one All-Pro team. Now, I know the Pro Bowl, sometimes votes come out weird. Sometimes guys are in Pro Bowl spots that they don't deserve. Shador Sanders was an example of that this year. I mean, you're calling Shador Sanders a Pro Bowl and mean it seriously. I question the validity of your analysis. But still, I think it's notable. 13 players, round 3 through 7, made the Pro Bowl. So 5 rounds, that's 13 players. So that's 2-3 guys each round. And 7 of those guys were all pro. Now, all pro means you were like one of the truly elite at your position. That means you're probably one of the top 3-4 guys at your position. And there were 7 guys picked in 5 rounds. So your odds aren't great, but there are great players out there. And I know the counter to this, and this is the argument that gets made whenever the Jets trade a day 3 pick for a player. And again, I'm not saying it's never a good idea to trade a day 3 pick for a player, but I think people discount the importance of day 3 picks because the way they view it is, well, your odds of hitting are low. But the problem is they don't properly account for the value of hitting on a day 3 pick and the value of missing on all your day 3 picks. The value of hitting on a day 3 pick is enormous. Look, hitting in the first round is key. Getting stars out of the first round is essential. But getting a star on day 3, that's a guy who's playing near the minimum wage for the first 4 years of his career. You are getting star talent for the price of a guy you can sign off the street, essentially. That's enormous surplus value for your team. The money that should be going to pay a star, you're getting star level production, and the money that you'd normally pay for a star can be allocated to other spots on your team. And missing on all your day 3 picks is really damaging. Now, most teams miss more than they hit on day 3, but the smart teams in this league, the successful teams in this league, they hit big on day 3 of the draft. And the reason it's important is I think you need to zoom out a little bit. Just think about an NFL team. Think about how many players are roughly making the minimum wage. Most rosters are players who are not making big money. Only the stars make big money in the NFL. So most of your players aren't making big money. And if we're being honest, most players who are making small money don't contribute a ton. There might be a guy who's a useful special teamer, might have a good depth player, somebody who plays defense in sub packages, but most of those guys aren't making big time contributions. But if you think about how many spots need to be filled on your team, you need to find starters. You need to find plus players who are making minimum wage. And the best way to do that is in the draft, because the veterans who are signing for the minimum wage for the most part, and there are exceptions, of course, you can find bargains sometimes in free agency, but the veterans who get the minimum wage, they're usually not contributing a whole lot. So it's got to be through the draft. Not doing it really damages your team because then you have holes all over your roster. Some positions have to be filled through late day 2, early day 3 picks. So how do you hit on these picks? Well, these aren't the obvious prospects. These aren't the guys who, are superstars that you or I can figure out. First round of the draft, there's a lot of consensus. You or I know who the top players are. And for the most part, the first round has the bulk of the good players. Hitting in the later rounds requires more ability. But even the smartest GM is not going to be able to figure out the stars all the time. You want to give yourself as many chances to hit on those picks because it has enormous value. And not doing it has enormous cost for your team. And I think this is the point that gets lost. Any individual late round pick, not that important. The expectation value is not that high. But if you keep sending late round picks out, you keep just disregarding those picks, well, you're depriving yourself of a chance to find essential players, guys who can produce, guys who can play at a high level for a minimum wage. A lot of building the NFL is not about the flashy moves. And I think a lot of successful team building in the NFL is kind of counterintuitive because we watch other sports. This is true in basketball. It's true in baseball. It's true in hockey. You go out and make flashy moves. You go out and get superstars. You go out and get big names. It's the way to build your team. The NFL is much more meticulous because you have a 53-man roster and you need a lot of contributors. One star moves the needle less in the NFL than a star in any other sport. And I think that's even true at the quarterback position. You put a quarterback on a team with no offensive line and no receivers, Patrick Mahomes, he's going to have issues. So you need to focus on the little things. It's about scouting. It's about player development. And it's about hitting on those day 3 picks. So, this kind of goes hand in hand with what I was talking about with Dexter Lawrence, that I think Dexter Lawrence is probably going to fetch some early picks, but there are also probably going to be some mid to late round picks that would be thrown into a trade. And that's not something I think the Jets should be looking to do right now. I think the Jets should be looking to add extra picks because they're a little short this year. That 3rd round pick went out for Haason Reddick. Jets don't have their own 3rd round pick this year. Jets fortunately got an extra compensatory pick at the end of round 4, but they need more. Jets may have a lot, but I still don't think they have enough. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about one way they can add those extra picks, and that's by trading down. Normally, teams value trade downs by using the classic trade point chart. They assign points to each pick. I think that chart has to go out the window, though, this year, and I'll explain why continuing here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We've been talking about player value on today's show. In the first segment, I explained why, although Dexter Lawrence is a fantastic player, star defensive lineman, I don't think he's a great fit for the Jets right now, and he's available in a trade. I can understand why people would be excited. I understand, especially I think there's an element of stealing a great player from the Giants that has a lot of Jets fans excited. I think just in general, we want more great players on this team, but I think there are many reasons he's just not a great fit. In the second segment, I took a pretty controversial stance that we undervalue late day 2 and day 3 draft picks right now. And it's not that you're particularly likely to hit on them. It's that you need to hit on them. And not hitting on them has very negative consequences. You look at the Jets through the years, especially these last 15 years when they missed the playoffs. They've gotten mostly awful results on day 3 of the draft. And many years they find themselves short on picks because they're trying to find some quick fix at some other position. And there's nothing wrong with trading a day 3 pick for a player, but you've got to replenish the well when you do it. You got to make sure you have an ample stock of day 3 picks. Well, one way you can get them is by trading down. And for where the Jets are in the NFL draft, in many ways, a trade down would be ideal because this is a year where having the 2nd pick is less attractive than in your typical year. Sometimes with pick 2, you get a legitimate quarterback prospect. Well, that's not really there for the Jets this year. I think that had Dante Moore entered the draft from Oregon, we'd be having a very different discussion right now. In fact, I'm pretty sure the last couple of months would have been spent debating whether or not the Jets should trade down from 2 or just pick more. And I think I probably would have sided on the idea of trading down. Well, even in years where there's not a great quarterback, usually there's like a true franchise pass rusher who's available, and a guy who's viewed as a can't miss, a guy who's a complete player, a guy who's a finished product. Now, there are viable options for the Jets at 2. Any of them who could become stars. Arvell Reese has a high ceiling. A lot of people are very high on him. David Bailey was an outstanding pass rusher at Texas Tech this year. I think there is a scenario where he hits big and he ends up being a star player. I think you could even throw Reuben Bain Jr. in the mix, although he seems to have far less buzz than the other 2. I think at the start of this process, when the college season ended, there was a lot more buzz about Bain being a potential number 2 overall pick than there is now. And there were some comments Aaron Glenn made recently about how much he loves Arvell Reese's length. And Bain has one of the shortest wingspans in NFL draft history for an edge rusher. So maybe that plays into it. We'll see. Or maybe the Jets are just hiding everything. It wouldn't be the first time a team has completely hidden their intentions. But there's not that can't miss guy. There's not that Nick Bosa, Joey Bosa. There's not that Aiden Hutchinson. There's that Myles Garrett. The typical top 2 pick as a pass rusher who you're going to plug in and he's going to be a 12 sack a year guy. No Chase Young, although Chase Young kind of missed. Chase Young was the can't miss guy who kind of missed. So it creates a difficult dynamic. And we've talked over the last week plus on this show about how the guys who seem like the most likely players to become all pros play what are known as the non-premium positions. And there are 3 guys in particular. Sonny Styles, who we discussed a lot yesterday out of Ohio State, a linebacker. His teammate Caleb Downs, who plays safety. And then Jeremiah Love, the running back out of Notre Dame, who we also discussed yesterday. And all 3 of these guys have a legitimate path to be, like top 5 of their position, all pro level talent. in a way that I think it's less likely for the 3 edge rushers, and certainly less likely for Ty Simpson, who I believe is the number 2 quarterback prospect right now and doesn't even seem like a consideration at 2. Maybe 16, maybe 33, maybe a trade up from 33, maybe something like that. But I don't think Ty Simpson's going to be in the mix. So if you're trying to get that blue chip player, and this is a Jets roster that's just so void of talent that I don't think you can be super picky about positions right now in a way you normally could be. And in a normal draft class, when you have the choice of a guy who's got who's got legitimate all-pro potential as a pass rusher versus a guy who's a legitimate all-pro potential at linebacker or running back or safety, you take the pass rusher. But it's a unique year where the guys at the non-premium positions could be the great players in this class. Do you want to take them at 2? I mean, it's a tough decision to make. And that's why I think the Jets really should be seeking a trade down, because this team just needs blue chip talent. And there may not be a blue chip pass rusher this year. I know that's a controversial statement. I know a lot of people will say that Reese is definitively a blue chip guy. Maybe he is, but I don't think he's a can't miss guy. I think he's very boom or bust. I think that there is a wide variety of potential outcomes from Arvell Reese. There's the variety where he justifies the Micah Parsons comparisons, Micah Fitzpatrick on the brain. There's a scenario where he justifies the Micah Parsons comparisons. There's a scenario where maybe he's not quite as good, but maybe he's kind of a jack of all trades type linebacker who does it all, like a Jamie Collins, if you remember him during his time with the Patriots. But there's also a scenario where he's a big miss. So there might be, I think there's a case that Downs, Love, and Styles are safer picks. There's no such thing as a can't miss prospect. I mentioned Chase Young earlier, who was viewed as a can't miss pass rusher, but these are guys who are very likely to be elite players at their position. Do you want to take them at 2, though? That's the challenge. So I think in an ideal world, the Jets would be able to trade down because it kind of hits it checks 2 boxes that I was focused on. Number one, it gives you a chance to draft that blue chip talent without worrying, is it too high at 2nd overall for a player who plays a non-premium position? And you can add to that stack of draft picks, particularly in the middle rounds, where maybe you can find the sleeper. It gives you more opportunities. The more picks you have, the more chances you have to find that rare diamond in the rough in the middle rounds. And that brings us to a question of what the Jets should accept in a trade. Now, normally teams are using what I call the Jimmy Johnson trade chart. It was a chart the Cowboys developed in the late 80s, early 90s. It was during their dynasty as they were building it. Essentially, what this chart does, it assigns a point value to each pick in the draft. And to this day, that's kind of the currency teams use when they make draft trades. They try to make sure that the points equal. The points we're sending out are equal to the points we get back. Higher picks are worth more points. Lower picks are worth less points. And the trades in the draft tend to get graded based on how closely they align with the trade value chart that the Cowboys came up with in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, a lot of research has shown that teams don't really accurately, that the chart doesn't accurately tell you how talented the players are at each pick. That there's a real question whether it actually gauges the true value of each pick in the draft. And a lot of evidence suggests that it overvalues earlier picks and undervalues later picks, and that trade downs actually benefit you more than trading up in the NFL draft. That's not to say a trade up is never appropriate. Of course, there are documented cases where a trade up has worked wonders for a team. There have been documented cases where a trade down has gone on to hurt a team. But for the most part, you win trading down more than you win trading up. That's the way it goes. Teams still use that Cowboys chart, though. But I think you also have to consider the draft that you're in, because that chart tends to go out the window when teams are trading into the top 5 for a quarterback. Teams typically overpay when they're moving up for a quarterback, particularly high in the draft. So if you were moving up from, say, 6 to 2 in a year where you're trying to get a quarterback and you worked out a trade where the points were equal, well, people would say the team trading down made a bad deal because quarterbacks are worth so much more that you throw the chart out. And this has gotten me thinking about this year's draft, where it's not a normal year, where it's frankly weaker, at least on paper, than most of your draft classes. And I think about what the Jets need. I think they need more picks and they need premium players. And I guess you could pick one of those guys at 2. I got to be honest with you, I could probably justify it more than in a typical year. In a typical year, if you told me linebacker at 2, running back at 2, safety at 2, I'd be so angry. If the Jets did it this year, I don't know how I'd feel about it. But I feel like part of me would accept it. And part of me would appreciate that for once a front office that tells you we're always going best player available actually means it. But in an ideal world, the Jets would be able to trade down. That said, there's no franchise passer at 2. There's no franchise quarterback at 2. And there's not even the typical pass rusher you'd move up to get it to. And that to me says that the second pick is not as valuable as it usually is. You're not going to get a player who normally fits the profile of a second pick. You're going to get a player who has a lesser profile. And to me, that means maybe you have to be willing to take lower value for the number 2 pick. Maybe losing on the trade value chart isn't the worst thing in the world, particularly because we know it doesn't really accurately value the picks anyway. So I'm not saying you trade down for anything. I'm not saying you go from 2 to 8 for a 7th round pick, but I do think that the threshold has to be lower, because the best thing for the Jets in this draft might just be to move down, get one of those blue chip talents and add to their stock of draft capital, because they certainly need it. So I know I've had a lot of controversial takes today, but I mean all of them. And I think that all of them have ample evidence to show that this is the way the Jets should go. I mean, it's the opposite of the way the Jets typically operate. So if the Jets get where they are by operating one way, maybe they should look to do the opposite thing. That's what I think anyway. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will have our weekly mailbag. Talk to you then. Can't wait to answer your questions.